All right. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first parent workshop with Candace this evening of the 22-2022. Oh my goodness, 23-24 school year. My name is Sarah Smith, the communication support for Tumwater School District. For tonight's topic, developmental overview K through 5. I have the first class jitters apparently and having a rough time with the speech tonight. We will post tonight's class on our website, TSD's website, along with prior classes that we have posted as well. We just ask for tonight for the classes if you can not personally record the class yourself, and if you need a reference to go back to it, just for confidentiality for everybody that's in the class tonight, we just ask if you use our recording. If anybody's got any questions, and I can also unmic people if they have questions for Candace this evening, don't hesitate, pop in at any time. So without further ado, Miss Candace, please take her away.
All right. So what we are talking about tonight is literally child development. And we're going to cover age 5 through age 11. And we're doing through 11 because there are several kids in 5th grade that are still will be 11. So we'll cover up to 11, and I'll explain more about that towards the end. But the reason why it's such a good idea for people to have a handle at any particular developmental stage on their child's brain development, normal developmental behaviors, and so on, is that we respond entirely different when we know a behavior is normal than if we think it's abnormal. If we know it's normal, we tend to respond to it. It doesn't mean you ignore a behavior if it needs to be addressed, but it means you address it without sort of that sense that something's wrong and get reactive. And that's our goal, is for you to be really clear about what normal is so that you can really work with each developmental stage to build the toolbox that might be necessary for that stage, but not be reactive and cause any kind of trauma to yourself as well, because it always feels good to a parent to hear a behavior that feels a little disconcerting and then find out it's literally just a really normal developmental stage. And a lot of these things that we're going to talk about are going to change regardless of what you do. So, some people say, well, what if what if we really want to work on them being really brash? And I'll say, well, you'll start to talk about that and you'll start to build the toolbox, but that brashness is going to be gone at 6 anyway. And so, some of these will just go away if you did absolutely nothing. But the main reason is to normalize for yourself and for your children, and then to put you in a position to be able to actually work with a characteristic rather than react to a characteristic. So we're going to start with 5. And 5-year-olds there are 2 ages in this group that we're talking about, the 5 through 11. There are 2 particular ages that are really, really one of your, what I would call heartfelt, sweet parenting ages. And those are 5 and age 10. 5 is really sweet and really so rewarding after 3 and 4, which are generally pretty challenging developmental stages. And you get to 5 and you can kind of see the work you've done and feel good about it. And we'll see the same thing again at 10. Now, when we talk about development, just in general, one of the things I want to remind people is that it tends to be that every other year is what we call an equilibrium or year of disequilibrium. So the exception to this will be our first year, maybe first partially 2 years, 5 and 6, that are kind of a little bit off slightly, but not entirely. So generally what you're going to find are the even years, are years of equilibrium. During equilibrium, kids just seem to be a little more comfortable with themselves and who they are and what they're capable of. They sleep better, they eat better, they socially are more comfortable. So we call that equilibrium. And then the off years are generally the odd years. So in the odd years in disequilibrium, what you'll see is they tend to be more anxious if they're kids that are sort of predisposed to anxiety. They tend to be a little more argumentative. They tend to be more emotionally volatile. They tend to be harder to get to sleep and keep asleep. So all of those sort of normal behaviors that we see generally come every other year. So disequilibriums are generally odd years, equilibriums are generally even years. With that said, they're also interfacing with temperament, and temperament is your child's hardwiring. So, of course, if you have a really challenging temperamented child, then you interface that with a disequilibrium. Those temperamental characteristics are really intense. So some of you in disequilibrium will have very intense disequilibriums. Some of you have really easygoing temperamented children and they hit a disequilibrium. You will hardly notice the difference between their disequilibrium and their equilibrium. So we'll see differences with kids, but I just want to kind of present that again to more normalize it for you. What we do believe happens is that in the periods of disequilibrium are generally periods of growth across the whole scope of development. So intellectual, social, emotional, physical. So when a lot of growth is happening, it kind of pulls the rug out from under that child and they're in disequilibrium. Then the equilibrium years tend to be years without as much growth across the spectrum, and it's kind of a practice year, so to speak, developmentally. And because of that, we see that equilibrium happen. So that's really the philosophy behind the equilibrium, disequilibrium that you'll see. And then with each particular developmental age, you'll see a different characteristic that's normal. So questions about the disequilibrium or equilibrium or any of what we've talked about before I start?
I do not see anything in the chat.
Okay, so we're going to start with a 5-year-old. So 5 particularly, and I have to say this because when I'm talking to parents of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, they're like, I try to give them this little little glitter of hope that 5 is so sweet, but I forget to say for 6 months. So I'm just being really clear. 5 is one of the sweetest years that you'll have in parenting, but it's about 6 months. And then you start to head into some disequilibrium at 5.5. So at 5, they want to be good. They mean to be good. They have a really positive outlook on life. Their mothers are the center of the world. They're focused. They're tried and true. They're very self-limiting. They know what they can do. They know what they can't do. They adore their mothers, but if something goes wrong, now this is really important because one of the characteristics we'll be talking about all the way through 5 is that they do adore mothers, but they sort of have this idea that mothers are omnipotent. And so what they do is that they'll come in so mad at you because they hit a rock on their bike and their bike fell over and you didn't tell them they were going to hit the rock. And that's how much power you have, is they believe that you can see and manage everything. So just understand when they're blaming you for something that happened when you weren't even there, that that's part of that developmental sense that mothers, they just adore you and believe you're absolutely can do anything. So if something goes wrong, it generally gets directed at you. They have very little worrying. So those of you who tend to have anxious children, you'll notice that at 5, they really are not particularly anxious. They're actually pretty calm and collected and feel comfortable with themselves. Now, 5.5, as they get closer to 6, these tendencies will get even stronger. Much more readiness to disobey again. They tend to get more brash and combative. One of the characteristics we'll see a lot of at 5, which is a way of defying and having power, is dawdling. They will dawdle eating. They will dawdle getting dressed. They will dawdle bathing. And so it can drive parents crazy in the sense of that, having to deal with all those life behaviors and have to deal with that intense dawdling. It's the beginning of sort of a really moody tantrumy age. As we start to talk about 6, we'll talk about it and you'll start to recognize it'll remind you a lot of 4, only more intense than 4. And so, but you're starting to see a little bit of it at 5.5. Physically at 5.5, you start to see their disequilibrium come in terms of physiology. You'll hear them talk about headaches. You'll hear them talk about stomach aches, their feet hurting, their face hurting. Some of that literally is growth and bone pain and that kind of thing. Some of it is anxiety as they start to move into a more intense age. And so you'll see, yes, the headaches and the stomach aches and so on. One of the characteristics you'll see a lot of now in the next couple of years, starting now at 5.5, is they'll do what we call centering behaviors. And these centering behaviors used to be things that our parents would label as bad habits, and they are not bad habits. I want to make this really clear that they are centering activities. They're activities that actually help your kids when they're feeling anxious or sort of out of sorts, to sort of feel more centered. And so you'll see a lot of them at 5 and 6. And some of that we think may have to do with teething as well. But you'll notice, especially starting around 5.5, that they chew on their clothing a lot. So you'll see them chewing like their shirts. You'll see them chewing their sleeve of their clothing. So they chew on clothing, they bite on pencils, they chew on toys, they have their hands in their mouth a lot. And when I say their hands in their mouth, I'm not talking about like this, I'm talking about like this, because they're actually getting their 6-year-old molars. So without thinking about it, they're getting those hands way back there to soothe themselves. As a result of that, what a lot of parents just drives them crazy is that there's a lot of saliva, and it literally sometimes can literally just really drape and drip all the way down their sleeve. So you'll see a lot of wet shirts, a lot of wet mouths, that kind of thing. But these are tension outlets. These are centering activities. Now, in terms of people, it's a really sweet year. They love and want to please their moms, especially best. They're close and expect their moms to read their minds, like we talked about. They're closer at 5.5 to, and may take things out on their moms, as we talked about. They're proud of their dads. They love their dads' companies. For the first time, they're really, really focused on grandparents. Not that they didn't love their grandparents before, but you'll start to actually hear them talk about loving their grandparents and their own relationship with grandparents. They're temporarily good with siblings. And I say temporarily because we will see sibling relationships are very much affected by development. So during years of equilibrium, we tend to see better sibling relationships. During years of disequilibrium, we tend to see poor sibling relationships. They get along best with peers outside their family. So that's a positive. Routine wise, they eat really well, but they eat really slow. So making a 5-year-old get up because they've been sitting there for a half an hour and still have food on their plate, you may not get actually the best nutritional outcome. So remind yourself they are really slow eaters. And if they want to leave food there, and sometimes what'll happen is they're so dawdly around eating that a lot of times everybody else will be done. And parents don't want to sit there for another half hour while they dawdle there with their food. But you can go ahead and get up, but leave their plate there. And a lot of these kids will come back and forth for another half hour, eventually actually emptying their plate. So they eat well, but they eat very slowly. They want what we call simple foods. They don't like their food to be mixed. It's not a year to give them casseroles. They want their meat, their vegetables, their carbs all to like be very separate. And you'll actually see kids get upset if one of them touches the other. So one of the things that works really well with 5-year-olds is actually to go back to some of the toddler plates where you had the little division between the spaces and where it can't seep into the other part of their food. So that's kind of one of the little idiosyncratic things about eating. Generally, sleep is good at 5. It's generally not an issue. They do have bad dreams though, a lot, and they cry out and scream in their sleep, but generally don't wake up and generally sleep pretty well. Toileting generally is no longer an issue at 5, with the exception, and I want to remind people about this, bedwetting is normal up to age 8. So this has a lot to do with how hard your kids sleep at night. If they are really sound sleepers and they have a small bladder and they've had fluids, that combination is likely to make them longer before they are actually dry at night. Some kids are dry because they don't drink a lot before they go to bed. They're light sleepers, so they can wake themselves up and go to the bathroom. But it's considered normal and not something to worry about. Generally, around 6 or 7, if the kids start to be uncomfortable, for example, wearing a pull up to bed and self-conscious about that, you can start to work with them and do some things like talking to them about when they're going to have their last fluids. You can do things like say, um, let's go potty before you go to bed. And then we'll do what we call peeing kids, which is we don't wake them up. We just pick them up asleep, pull their pants down, stick them on the toilet, and tell them to go to the bathroom. In light sleep, a lot of these kids will empty their bladder while they're still asleep, throw them back into bed, and they'll stay dry until morning. Some kids, we can just say, we're going to get you up. And as soon as you hear them stirring, you just go right in, because a lot of kids pee right after they wake up in the morning. And so, there are ways to get around those last couple years, but regardless of what you do, I want to normalize that it is normal to have bedwetting up until age 8. So there's no shaming or any pressure on yourself or on your kids to change that. Now, generally what you'll find is they do bathe independently by 5. They tend to not have much resistance to bathing. They may need some reminders. But for the most part, they're pretty good. They can and don't dress themselves independently. And again, on a good day, they'll dress themselves. On a day that they're tired or distracted, they don't dress themselves very well. We tend to see girls generally tend developmentally to be more independent in dressing than boys are. I don't worry about it at all. I don't know any 15-year-old boys that their parents are still dressing them. It's one of those things that over time just resolves itself. Probably the most important thing to do is just to be really relaxed about it and kind of move around on it. So one morning you may say, I'm really busy. I have to get ready to get myself out the door for work, so I won't be able to help you today. Another day you might say, I've laid all your clothes out and, they're ready to put on, but I have to get your brother ready. Another day you may say, I don't have anything to do, I'll dress you. And usually our best outcome around this is if you'll move around on that boundary a little bit around dressing, and eventually they just dress independently. Okay, so that's pretty typical development for a 5-year-old. Any questions about your 5-year-old before we move on to 6?
I am not seeing anything in the chat.
Great. Okay. So 6 is a really intense age. It is considered one of the ages of equilibrium because in many ways kids are very confident, feel good about themselves, but it really appears as a disequilibrium to a lot of parents because it's so intense. So the first description of a 6-year-old is they are bipolar. They can be absolutely delightfully sweet in the next minute, you can shift to this incredibly oppositional child. And you don't know if you necessarily know when that's going to happen. So at 6, they're more adventurous, they're more daring, they live at opposite ends of extremes, they have a really hard time making choices. So those of you who've been giving choices as one of the way of managing your kids in terms of power and sort of ease around things, it may not work well at 6 because they get so conflicted about having to make the right choice for themselves. So sometimes they'll say, well, play with choices, see how they respond. Some kids can make choices in the morning and not at night. Some kids can make choices at night, but not in the morning. So you can play with that. They tend to be incredibly stubborn at 6. They still really adore their mothers, but as we talked about before, if something goes wrong, it's their fault. Um, the thing that's probably the most challenging about 6, or at least one of the most challenging things about 6, is they're incredibly competitive. Now, this is one of those ages that if you interface a competitive, temperamentally competitive child in a developmentally competitive period, you've got off the wall competitive. If you have a child who's not very temperamentally competitive, this characteristic can be really almost non-existent. You don't hardly notice it, but they want to be first at everything. They want to be best at everything. They always want to win. They always want to have the most of everything. So the behaviors you'll see are they are racing everywhere. They have to be the first one to the car. If you get to the car before they do, they have a meltdown. They have to win to the extent that they will cheat. Absolutely no qualms about cheating. It's way more important for them to win than to have any kind of moral compass around this. So one of the things I want to be really clear about is this is absolutely developmental. And so if you don't really want to deal with the cheating or the fact that they're going to change the rules in the middle of the game so they're sure to win, that kind of thing, just say, I don't feel like playing, or I don't want to play the game. Don't shame them about it because it's not going to make a bit of difference. They just are so driven to win. Um, or just accept that they're going to cheat to win that game. They want the most of everything. This is that embarrassing age where you see them looking at the slices of cake somewhere and pick the biggest piece. That's just how they are. So that is probably one of the things that's strongest. Now you're going to see a lot of separation anxiety at this age. And I think it kind of catches people off guard to see so much separation anxiety. But I want to normalize this again. We haven't seen separation anxiety like this. We saw it at 4. We definitely saw it, and 2.5 and 1.5. But we see it again at 6.5 and 6. And a lot of people, it kind of scares them to see it. They refuse to stay in bed. A lot of them have a lot of anxiety about sleeping alone again. Want to sleep with you, want to sleep next to you, want to sleep on the floor by you. Again, strategies around that are helpful because it is partially developmentally driven. I think one of the most annoying things about 6 is a lot of smart talk, a lot of what our parents would have called talking back. And, a lot of like, why should I? Why do you want to know? And that sort of nasty little attitudinal stuff. I really want to make clear to people a lot of that is not intending to be, as parents think, be a smart aleck or be resistant or oppositional. A lot of it has to do because they're really sort of confident and arrogant, and they think they're being really cool by talking like that. And sometimes just simply by saying, gosh, that hurt my feelings, or you didn't need to say it that way. They're kind of shocked. Like they don't even recognize that they'd said anything unkind or challenging. So just remember that smart talk you're going to address, but probably better to address it like, can you say that in a different way? Or that hurt my feelings, or you didn't need to say it like that, or repeating it back the way it could have sounded. All of those are way better than confronting them or getting really oppositional back to them, because remember, you are in a very, very competitive age at 6. So they're going to compete. If you do something that sort of triggers them into that competitive mode, they're just going to escalate the behavior in order to, quote, sort of win and save face. So remind yourself that you want to use a softer approach in dealing with that. Not that you're not going to just let it go by, but you want to deal with it in an approach that doesn't escalate it. They can't be wrong. They don't deal with criticism well at this age. They love to be flattered. They love praise. Very, very sensitive emotionally. You'll see kids just fall apart or get angry like you hadn't seen them get angry. They don't seem to be able to really self-regulate well at 6. So very, very emotionally volatile. They're very bold, very brash, say things that can be hurtful, but aren't necessarily intended to be hurtful, just that sort of really arrogant, bold, brash energy. They're very, very reactive to physical hurts, the tiniest little physical hurt. And so it's kind of a joke in when we look at the team sports, because about half of the games are spent addressing kids who've been bumped and are down and holding a leg and holding an arm. And there's a lot of reaction to physical hurting. They're extremely enthusiastic around games. That same competitiveness usually shows up in academics. They're full of ideas. So oftentimes when you see these really intense behaviors, you have to really remind yourself that they have a flip side that's generally really positive in them. And as a rule, these kids are really emotionally warm and really sweet to be with. Now, interesting enough, 6.5, which used to be the half year before we hit the 5, 6, 7, we would have disequilibrium every half year. So the first year is equilibrium, the second half of the year would be disequilibrium. But now what we see is generally year by year, starting at age around 7. And so 6 is kind of that in between transitional period. And at 6.5, we actually, a lot of parents think of 6.5-year-olds as being really wonderful to live with, because we're starting to see some of the disequilibrium of 7, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But it's such a relief after that intensity of that, or that first 6 months of 6, where they're so competitive and so brash and bold and so intense emotionally, that when they start to hit their disequilibrium, it actually feels like equilibrium to a lot of parents. So they tend to be quieter, nice, warm, friendly, more withdrawn and melancholy, which is kind of a relief to parents, but we'll talk about how that becomes more challenging as they actually hit 7. Their humor is off the wall. They are so funny and so charming and so amusing at 6.5. It's really fun. They love guessing games at this age. In terms of 6-year-old routines and health stuff, it's a challenging year. Table manners are outrageous. You won't see table manners this outrageous again until his kids hit, believe it or not, 14. And they're stuff their mouths, they grab food, they knock over their milk half the meals you have them, they teeter back in their chairs, they just have really incredible outrageous table manners that actually go away without much intervention, but you can't help but, say, let's move your glass back, fill their glass half full, put them in chairs that don't teeter as easily because it's so exhausting. Again, as we talked about at 5, dawdling is part of power. So they eat painfully slow, but they eat well. They eat a pretty good amount of food. They, as we talked about, always want the biggest piece, but don't necessarily finish that biggest piece. Sleep-wise, usually they go to bed pretty easily. Usually you can get about 11 hours of sleep. They rarely have bad dreams at this age. Bathing and dressing, they start to prefer not to, especially start resisting hair washing. And again, hair washing and hair combing, either one. And I just want to remind people it is not worth dying on the hill for. This is completely a developmental stage. So don't fight this. It's like bathe them, every few days, wash their hair once a week if it starts to get stinky. If they have that little fuzzy part in the back or that flat part in the back, don't care if you go look at a first grade or kindergarten classroom, they all have it. You don't have to be embarrassed about it. It's not worth fighting over. There's so many other things that are challenging. Okay, in terms of their tension outlets, a lot of them, again, as we talked about, so you'll still see the chewing in a lot of the kids and chewing on their clothes. You'll also see a lot of nose picking. You'll see a lot of swinging their legs really hard, a lot of wiggling. You'll see a lot of nail biting, and reminding yourself it's nail biting, again, is not a quotes bad habit. It's a centering activity. So anytime kids have a centering activity and you take that centering activity away, they're just going to respond by acting out or picking another centering activity that actually may end up being more offensive. So, if you're going to replace, for example, biting their fingernails, they're what we call oral centers. So, you have to give them something they can legitimately chew on. They'll probably chew on the ends of their pencil and chew their erasers off. They may chew on their clothes more. So just remind yourself is that you're always going to have to replace something if you take it away in terms of a centering activity. That's why you'll notice at some of the stores, they'll have these necklaces with big chewing beads and things that are kind of cool that hang off that are like almost like the toddler chewing toys that are cool for the kids to wear, because some of the parents will be like, well, I'd rather have them chew on these rubber necklaces than to chew on their clothes or to bite their fingernails. So just remember those are centering activities. Tantrums can be incredibly violent again and really scare people because kids are a lot bigger. It's one thing to see a tantrum in a 2-year-old. It's more challenging to see it in a 4-year-old, two other big tantruming ages. But to see it a big tantrum in a 6-year-old is really can be overwhelming and can be embarrassing if you're in public settings of any kind. But again, I want to normalize this because you don't want to react to it. You don't want to hit them. You don't want to, do things that scare them. It's like these are just really intensely emotionally unregulated kids starting into disequilibrium. They'll start to try to do things like hit again, kick again, that kind of thing. It isn't okay. You are going to restrain them, but I want to remind you that they need big releases when you're having these big feelings. So as you're saying, I will not let you kick me. You can say you can stomp your feet. You will say you can't hit me, but you can, throw your arms down and go, you can growl. You can growl instead of spit. So you're just going to keep moving these kids to something more sophisticated, but they need to have that release. So if you try to stop the release completely, you're going to end up getting an outcome you're not going to be pleased with or looking for. They're also incredibly clumsy at this age. A lot of walking into door jams, a lot of tripping over things. So when we start to see disequilibriums, we see them go across the board, including their physical sort of well-being. Health-wise, again, similar to what we saw at 5, aches and pains, sensitivity to what they're wearing, sometimes things that are rough around their neck, that kind of thing. They have really high communicable disease. And that may be a lot of the fingers up the nose and then fingers in their mouths, so a lot of germ spreading that happens at this age, and ears and throats, especially vulnerable. So questions about your 6-year-old?
I'm gonna go ahead and let me see if I can unmute everybody real quick.
Yeah.
Ask all to unmute just to see if anybody has any questions. I haven't seen anything in the chat, but I'm gonna go ahead and unmute and see if
Yeah. And this can be
anybody has
open to
anything.
guys too, right? And it can be open to 5 or 6 or the equilibrium, disequilibrium stuff. So any questions about that?
Marissa had said that she wished she had attended sooner. Welcome.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel free to please, go to the website to go back to this one, or there's a couple years, school years prior that we have of classes. So please feel free to go back and look at those, definitely. So
Yeah. Absolutely.
I
And
guess
it's really nice. Once people recognize about development, a lot of people will say, oh my God, why didn't people tell me this before? But I just want to remind you from here on out, you can check every single year of your child's life to see what is normal development. And we generally tend to do development of grade school, middle school, and high school. So you'll be able to actually follow all the way through. And we'll talk about the middle school stuff at the end of this. So, okay.
I do have a question. I've got two.
Okay.
Um, how do I help her? So it's a student, a parent that has a daughter with
Okay.
extra energy in first grade. She keeps getting in trouble for talking and not sitting still. She has social anxiety. And then after we touch on that one, I have one more question.
Okay. So, it's still really early, and, some of this may be temperamental, and some of your kids are very kinesthetic and will be what we call kinesthetic learners. And so, one of the things you might want to check in with at the school is how much time are they giving the kids to move around? Like, she would probably be a kid who would do better going from center to center, where she gets to actually move and, intermittently. We also have chairs that move. They have um, they have stools, or they have, some kids will sit on balls where they're sitting at their desk on a ball. So they're literally moving the whole time, and they actually focus better if they're moving or keeping their stool from going. So we'll have single foot stools that kids have. So check with and see at school with your teachers if they have any of those things or using any of those things. And some of that at 6 is they are so bold and brash. And I don't know if she's 6 or 6.5, but you may see some of that change as they are a little more self-regulated at 6.5. So some of this could just be developmental as well. Okay, I hope that's enough to start. What about the second question?
Do we ever see equilibrium and disequilibrium? So in 6 months since, it seems to be that I've seen my son with my son.
Say it more again to me. I'm not sure what the question. Say it again to me.
Do we ever see equilibrium and disequilibrium? So in 6 month stints.
Sorry, that was my typo. I meant to
Okay.
say, do we ever see it go? I couldn't fix it. So I've seen sort of a shift every 6 months, it seems like. And I'm just wondering if that is
How
a
old is your
thing.
child?
He is almost 8.5 now.
Okay, so generally, probably what you're seeing is when we talk about equilibrium and disequilibrium, we generally talk about them coming at the year and a half year up until the full year one, which he would be in a full year one now. But some kids' disequilibriums will come at 8 and 3 months, and then, which means they would be in disequilibrium a little before 9, for example, or a little before 10, and their equilibrium would come a little after the next age. So they're always going to have the same amount of equilibrium and disequilibrium as a rule, but it can come a little off so that it looks like it's not right at the age it is. Does that make sense? So if
Yes.
you have an
Okay.
8-year-old, you may notice that as they get closer to 9, they really are having 9-year-old behavior.
Okay.
Does
Okay.
that make sense?
Yes. Yes, that
Okay.
makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Anything else?
I am not seeing anything in the chat. Um,
And please don't hesitate, you guys, to unmute yourself if you need some in the moment, you need some clarification or ask a question. I am fine for you to unmute yourself and ask. Okay. Are we
all
ready to
right.
think?
Yeah, I think we are good.
Okay, so 7. 7 is our first full year of disequilibrium. And it is a really interesting year of disequilibrium. I call it the Eeyore year, like the Winnie the Pooh Eeyore, who's just really always baha boo melancholy. Generally, they are an age of incredible withdrawal. They pull in so much. They're silent, they're less giving in company. They feel like people in their lives are mean and hateful, and people are always picking on them. They think that people don't like them. You'll hear them talk about, I don't have any friends at school. They're moody, they're morose, they're melancholy. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten calls from parents and they will say, "How old can a child be before you start to recognize depression?" And the first question I ask is, "Are they 7?" And they'll say yes. And I'll say, well, that's really normal development for a 7-year-old. So they're that moody, morose, melancholy. Girls, especially girls, but both genders are incredible worriers about everything. They're anxious about everything. They have intense fear of the dark, of being late for school, of shapes in the room. I mean, we could go on and on and on. They feel like they have all the bad luck. They think they always lose, that everybody else is luckier than they are. They feel like their parents love their siblings more. They talk about it all the time about how you love my brother more, you love my sister more. They think their parents do more for siblings. They think their parents do more for other kids. They're incredibly easy to disappoint. They're disappointed all the time over the simplest little thing. But what's interesting about this age is they are so challenging to live with at home because you feel like you're just walking on eggshells and living with this really unhappy child all the time. But if you talk to a teacher, they love 7-year-olds because those brash, bold, active 6-year-olds, competitive 6-year-olds, are now in this withdrawn age and sitting really still. They're really good listeners. They're really good students. They're very reasonable. They're not competitive. So, from a teacher's perspective, this is a year of equilibrium, but it's actually disequilibrium. They're definitely an age not known for humor. So those of you who've used humor to kind of get your kids out of a bad mood probably need to look for another tool because they get so offended and actually get more upset if you use humor with them. They have a lot of difficulty transitioning, a lot of difficulty stopping activities. So it is one of the things that teachers have a challenge with is that they'll be ready to move on to another subject or another activity, and the kids will be so resistant because they're not done or they have a little more to do. So incredibly difficult for them to transition at this age. So if you've already have a child who temperamentally struggles with transition, you'll notice 7 is a really challenging year for that. They retreat a lot. It is so incredibly important for them to have their own space. They're very, very sensitive about having a particular chair at the table. a particular seat in the car. So it seems like they're being incredibly difficult, oppositional, challenging, because they're freaking out because their little brother or older brother got into their seat in the car or sitting at their chair at the table. But that is just one of the characteristics, is they really, really need their own space at 7. They're also sensitive in terms of body space. It's a year where they are very sensitive about being touched, about being bumped. They're not very physically affectionate unless they initiate it. They don't really want people hugging them or fiddling with them. They have a lot of perfectionism and anxiety this age. It's probably one of the things that doesn't work for teachers at 7, is there's a lot of perfectionism they're struggling with. If you temperamentally have a child who tends to be perfectionistic, this is a tough year. If you have an older or only child who tend to be more perfectionistic, 7 is a tough year. So we tend to see that characteristic amp up at 7. They are, however, way more self-regulated. They control their bodies. You don't see them hitting and kicking like you did earlier. They control their anger outbursts. They control their voices. They aren't screaming or crying loud anymore. So way more self-regulated, but it comes at the cost of that incredible moody, melancholy sort of behavior. Their conflicts are chiefly with their mothers. They, if there's going to be a conflict, it's with their moms. If they can avoid siblings, it's the best. They are not good with siblings. They're jealous of siblings. They're annoyed by siblings. 7 would be an age they would be happy if they didn't have a sibling. And the best way to manage it is just to sort of try to keep them as separate as possible. You'll notice a lot of the parents will talk about being concerned because they've had these really social 6-year-olds, and then they'll hit 7, and all of a sudden their kids don't want to go to play dates. They don't want to have kids over. I don't worry about it at 7. It generally is just an age where they just have much less need for companionship, and just, I think, are more comfortable just being where it's familiar and where they don't have to perform in any particular way or deal with anyone in any particular way. So if I saw it carry over into 8, then I worry. But when I see it at 7, it's just part of the development. But I think this is one of the hardest years for parents to really understand, is that this isn't something you can, humor them out of, or, say to them, I saw you have a lot of friends. It's like, you can say that, and it's true, they have a lot of friends. If you went to their playground, you'd see they're playing with all kinds of kids. This is literally internal. Their perceptions are they have no friends. And so it's one of those things of being compassionate, but also not being anxious about. This is just a really interesting developmental stage. Okay, so questions about 7, because I know it is kind of a unique age.
I do not see anything in the chat.
Okay. All right, so now 8 comes, and 8 as is, the thing about a development is that it is just flips from one year to the next to something completely different. And 8 is a year of equilibrium. And kids are outgoing, they're lively, they're evaluative, they have high, high, high. The characteristic of 8 is just this incredibly high energy level. They feel like and act like they can tackle anything. They are speedy, speedy, speedy all the time, everywhere, anything you're doing. So it leads to a lot of carelessness. They get hurt a lot because they're running around and aren't careful where they step or what they run into. They are generally, what you'll notice is at school, their school performances, we'll talk more about it, but mediocre. And part of it is that speediness. They're evaluative. They tend to be hard on themselves. They're extremely sensitive to perceived criticism. I say perceived because a lot of times people aren't even intended to criticize them, But if they, for whatever reason, perceive criticism, it's devastating to them. Intellectually, incredibly expansive, really fun to introduce 8-year-olds to new things because they are so expansive intellectually. They talk a lot. We don't have an age that talks like this since they were 3 years old, to the point of where parents are like, I just don't think I can listen to them talk one more minute. They just are absolutely just talking, talking, talking from the minute they wake up till the minute they go to sleep. Everything is expressed in high drama. It's that same sort of intensity we see in that high energy. So a lot of high drama. Personal space, way more expansive, willing to share space, wanting to be in spaces with other people. They have more physical coordination. One of the interesting things about 8 is that we generally will see kids' bodies morph all the way up through high school for the boys, up to high school generally for the girls. And we'll see kids and they'll kind of grow and then they'll get a little bit um, kind of doughy, and then they'll shoot up again and get a little doughy again and shoot out up again, that kind of thing. Really typical for bodies to change. But 8, interestingly enough, is one of the ages that for a window, you'll kind of have an idea of what their body's going to look like as adults. They have an adult sort of shaped body, what their body shape will look like in adults generally around 8. And then you may see them again morph until they get to that adult body. But it's kind of fun to see at 8 for these kids. Their emotional and attitudes of their parents, their friends are really important. People are important to 8-year-olds. How they feel about others, how others feel about them is really, really significant at 8. They are, as a result, incredibly nosy, nosy, nosy. So you will have them say to you, who are you talking to? Were you talking to? What were they saying to you? Why did you say when you're talking on the phone or in a conversation with friends? Or it's not unusual to open a bedroom door where you thought you were having a prior conversation with a partner and they fall in because they had their ear up to the door. Very, very nosy. So it's a good time to start to talk to them about there are things that are private and there are things that we choose, who we choose to share things with and who we choose not to share things with. So you're going to start to work with them and coach them because they are so nosy at this age. Their performance at school and sometimes in sports tends to be pretty mediocre. Part of that is that speediness. They're just super speedy. They just want to get through a handout. And so they don't really do their best work or they write really sloppily. Don't worry about it. If it needs to be addressed, let a teacher address it. It's really not worth your relationship with them to make them rewrite something because they're writing sloppy, or to go over their paper and say, you need to go back over this and check your answers because you answered too quickly. Let teachers do that correcting. It's just one of those ages where speed is going to be important, and I want to say this, you've got an age coming up that you are going to miss this speedy, relaxed academic kid because it can get so intense after this sometimes. So this is just where they are. It's just not a year of intense performance. And if people are critical of them, yourself included, they think that it's really your standards are just too high. And that's why I don't really want parents engaged in some of this and let teachers do it, because I don't want it to interfere with your rapport with your kids. It's like your rapport is way more important than something that's going to developmentally pass. They're hard on others and they usually rationalize their attacks on other people as self-defense. It's really hard for them to own their own stuff. They have a very, very high need for praise. And as I said, have a really, really difficult time with criticism at 8. So that's your 7 and 8. Questions about 7 and 8?
I think I'm going to go ahead and ask
Yeah,
I'll
go ahead.
unmute. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free. I don't have anything in the chat, or I think we're okay.
Okay, excellent. All right. So let's talk about 9. So 9 is your biggest, hardest year of disequilibrium in this 5 to 10. And I'm leaving 11 out, and I'll explain to that to you in a minute. But in this 5 through 10 age group, 9 is going to be your hardest year of disequilibrium. It's interesting because it's a difficult disequilibrium for kids of almost any temperament, and that's what makes it so challenging, is that whatever their more challenging temperamental characteristic is, it's going to interface with the disequilibrium of 9. So it gives you a little taste. The one nice thing I think that is good about dealing with the 9 of disequilibrium is it gives you a taste of what you're going to start to deal with in middle school, when we start to hit some really difficult disequilibriums. And it gives you a chance to sort of practice your attitude about some of the disequilibrium that you're going to be dealing with. So 9 is really uneven, so uneven, unexpected. It may be said that the one thing happens one day, the opposite's going to happen the next day. So incredibly unpredictable what their behavior will be. They have a long, strong preoccupation with mothers, which all those years, mothers tend to get the brunt of a lot of their intensity and their emotions. And for the first time at 9, it gets distributed to both parents, which is not fun, but a relief for moms to have it get some of it get directed at dads as well. They're independent, they're self-motivated, they're self-starters. So like 7, 9s are actually good academically. Teachers usually like 9-year-olds. And now there will be some drawbacks to that as we talk about this. But for the most part, in terms of school, they're generally going to be seen as a good year to have in school. They like to do things in their own way, their own time, their own direction. So they do best in school settings where they're given some choices and some independence. They do best with responsibility. They like being given responsibility. They are, however, incredibly anxious, more withdrawn, less certain, less speedy than we saw at 8, much less so. So those, again, those of you who have the kids who have that predisposition towards anxiety, you'll notice it really amp up again at 9. They're driven by time, but they want to do everything and they hate to give up anything. So we have kids who want to do every activity, but literally by the end of the week are a mess. They cannot self-regulate what they're capable of really doing. They want to elaborate on their productions, on their art, on their work at school. They will do things like work on a map, and it'll say color in and put the capital city of on your state. And 3 hours later, they're saying, where is the wax paper? They're shining it up to have a actual coating on it. 5 minutes after that, they're saying, can I burn the edges of this so it looks like a real map? They cannot stop elaborating. Those of you who have the kids who tend to be perfectionists are going to be really recognizing how they don't seem to be able to get to a place where it feels like enough and they don't have to keep working on it. They take themselves and their occupations very seriously, want to do everything just right. They have a high need for internal are for external praise, but I want to say, different from 8-year-olds, that external praise that they are so in need of is because they have incredibly high self-demands. Their internal critic is incredibly active at 9. They're interested in perfecting their skills. They'll want to do the same thing over and over again. That's why you'll see your kids draw the same drawing over and over again. And you'll say, why don't you draw something else? Or why don't you draw? It's like, because they really, really get focused on trying to perfect something. They get wound up in their activities, have a very hard time with transitions again. Their willpower is very strong. They tend to do almost everything and anything they feel like they want to do in their way, their own accord. So there's a lot of conflict that a lot of parents aren't used to, and a lot of conflict that they used to be able to work with their kids to get them out of that locked in place, and they just really lock in. So again, if we have a child who temperamentally tends to lock into things and then they hit 9, it's a tough stage to parent. They show considerable social criticism. They're very critical of other people, very critical of their peers, as well as being self-critical. Things are what they are. They're very much about realism. They have very, very intense emotions, again, variable and uneven and unpredictable. They worry a lot. They complain a lot. And they love intellectual pursuits, absolutely thrive with intellectual pursuits. In terms of conflict, they tend to like to collect things. That fairness, this is a really important one. Fairness is extremely important to them. So they will do anything for what they think is fair. So for example, one of my sons, we were all playing this softball game at Mother's Day where there was a bunch of younger kids, older kids, parents, and we just divided the teams up pretty randomly. We're just playing softball. And my son was getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And finally, he just threw the bat and went off. He was so mad that the teams weren't fair. And so the next day I sat down with him and I was talking about, it's not always about fairness. Before I knew about development, it's not always about fairness, that this is, partially just for fun. It's, it doesn't matter who wins. It doesn't matter who loses. And it's like, there'll be people who won't want to play with you if you get all locked into fair. And he listened very sweetly, kindly. And then I got done. He got up and he said, well, I guess I won't be playing softball with you anymore. It's like, that is how it is. It's like, fair is fair is fair. And again, if you temperamentally have a kid who's about fairness and you hit 9, there's just no moving around that. They have incredible disdain for the opposite sex, but we think that may be sort of related to sort of early flirting. They start to like to talk things over with friends and have a more serious conversations with their friends. They're impatient. They're quick to anger. They're persistent, but they are incredibly loyal and devoted friends, which is a really sweet characteristic, but it's the beginning of the code of silence and the code of loyalty. So you want to start talking about, there are some things you don't keep secret if they're going to hurt someone. There are things you don't join somebody on if you know that it's going to hurt someone else. So start talking a little bit about some of that code of loyalty and that code of silence, because it gets to be a huge problem when they hit 11, 12, 13. Behaviors are more influenced, as we talked about when I started, by what their individual personality traits are. Their temperamental character traits are all amplified at 9. So any of those more challenging temperamental characteristics are going to be amplified at 9. So everybody absolutely everybody sees 9 as disequilibrium. Okay, so questions about your 9-year-old or your 7, 8, or 9. Any of them come up?
I'm going to ask to unmute if anybody wants to. It doesn't look like anything is in the chat.
Okay, I'm going to assume we're good. All right, so now we're at 10. And 10, as I said, starting off, is one of those magic ages. 10 is such a sweet, sweet developmental year. They're compliant, they are friendly, they're enjoyable, they're about as predictable and consistent as they could possibly be. It is the picture of equilibrium and development. They're less fearful than they were at the other ages. However, there are a few things they are fearful of. And some of the things that 10-year-olds are fearful of are school. They tend to be a little bit hypochondriacal. So they fear becoming sick. They tend to be a little sensitive in terms of physical sensations. So they don't like height. They don't like that sense of vertigo. And they're more conscious of sort of the bigger world. So they worry a little bit about sinister people. But other than that, they generally tend to be just really easygoing. They're relaxed, they're confident. They don't like parents fighting for that same reason. They just want everybody to be happy. They don't like fighting with their parents. They don't like their parents fighting. They don't like fighting with friends. They don't want to move. It is a year where they are just so incredibly happy in their equilibrium that moving is really, really anxiety producing for them because they're so relaxed and comfortable and love the predictability both in themselves and in their world. They do, though, have some anxiety about school tests, grades, sports, some of that competitive stuff. I think because they aren't particularly comfortable right now with performance. They really don't care about performing as much. They just want that comfort. And all of those things cause some discomfort to them. So that's tough because there's a lot of school testing at 10 and some of the, tests that will be done across the board. So that stuff is hard. They like having clothes and possessions that are like their peers. And that's because we're starting to move into the 11, 12, 13, which we'll talk about in a minute. But they aren't obsessed with it. They're just starting to notice that there are clothes that certain kids wear and certain clothes they don't wear. So they're just getting a little more aware of it. Sexuality wise, well, this is something we haven't talked about, but generally we see kids more interested in their sexuality and sexuality in general in years of equilibrium. So we see a lot of sexual play, for example, at age 6. We see a lot of sexual kind of interests, like showing your underpants or saying, things that are talking about penises or butts or whatever, or laughing about things or making jokes about body parts or pooping or whatever at 8. At 10, we start to see some same-sex sex play. We'll see some puppy love between both genders. They have crushes on same and opposite sex. They do a lot of smutty jokes and gestures and drawing naked figures and sex related that way. So it is another year of sort of being more sexual, but it just kind of evolves as they hit those equilibriums in that. So a really typical thing was one time we were driving a group of kids to school, and my friend stopped on her way back because the cars had all had foggy windows. And when the kids all got up, she noticed that they had written fuck on all the windows. So that's really typical of like 10-year-old behavior is just that, playing with words and with gestures and things that they know are on that edge of being kind of smutty, and that's a typical sex play of a 10-year-old. But in general, it is the sweetest year, which before I move into 11, I want to talk a little bit about, because this is a year where I think a lot of parents feel great relief, a lot of sense of accomplishment as parents. They're seeing their kids with making good decisions, being more self-reliant, responsible, kind, fun. I mean, just there's just so many things that are so sweet about 10 that we just feel like we've really done the right things. And then 11 comes. So I'm going to give you some information about 11. Hopefully, we will get an opportunity, probably not this year, but maybe next year, people might want to request doing middle school development, because middle school development, 11, 12, 13, generally first year of high school, 14. So 11, 12, 13, 14 is a very unique developmental stage with a lot of very unique characteristics. And I'm going to hit on those a little bit tonight, just because there are a few of your kids who are going to hit 11 in their last year of elementary school. But there's a lot more than I'll give you tonight. And one of the things that's so hard about hitting middle school development is that you come off of hitting that incredibly sweet year of 10 equilibrium, and to hit that incredibly sweet year and then hit that really unusual behaviors that are going to come in middle school is kind of a culture shock for parents and a really difficult adjustment. So let's start by just giving you some general 11-year-old characteristics and behaviors. And then I'm just going to quickly give you just a little taste of what happens to the brain starting around 11 that is going to really shift a lot of how your kids behave, function, and how you parent them from there for the next 3 or 4 years. So 11-year-olds are highly contrary and oppositional. Like you haven't seen oppositional like this since they were 3. They're egocentric, they're energetic, they're constantly in motion, talking, moving, fiddling. They have little to no willingness to cooperate, even in minor ways. They're slow to respond. They're quick to criticize, very critical. They're not helpful. If anything, they're resistant to helping with almost anything. Definitely, it's an age of practicing strength. So the age is your kids are starting to get almost the same size that you are, or as big as you are, and they start playing with that strength. So they'll just spontaneously come over and pick you up, and you're kind of caught off guard. Or they'll spontaneously come and just kind of body slam you into a wall or jump on you. Or you'll just see a lot of this playing with strength at this age. And they don't really totally understand their strength themselves. They're experts at baiting adults, especially their parents, especially mothers. So mothers, again, will become the target for the next 2 or 3 years of really intense baiting. They eat constantly. They'll get up from the table and say they're hungry. So constantly eating away from a home. And I just want to say this because it is such a challenging year that I think a lot of parents are terrified about them being or seen by anyone else. But it's interesting because away from home, they're super mannerly, they're very helpful, and they're really sweet and outgoing. And so if you hear people say how great your kids were over at their house, take it in, because that's the indication you're going to have of what a good job you're doing. Because from your perspective, you've completely failed. But by hearing this outside perspective, you'll recognize they are actually getting a lot of those characteristics you've been working on. Their conduct at school is not very good. It's often poor. They may even be working hard for grades, but this has to do with brain. And I'm going to talk about their brains in a minute here. They may say they hate school, but they don't want to miss any days. It's incredibly important for them to be with their peers, 11, 12, 13, and 14. There's nothing more important than love and belonging. So they could hate school and the academics of school and the demands of school, but they don't want to miss school because they don't want to miss that love and belonging and that social interaction. They're absolutely oblivious to how they impact others. They're incredibly self-absorbed, miss a lot of the cueing and cluing that they're given. They do not pick up subtleties. They have to be motivated from within. If you're going to get any help with tasks, it's helpful to let them pick what they want to do to get more motivated. Like, we need to empty the dishwasher, we need to fold clothes, and we need to feed the animals. Which one do you want to do? You're going to get way less resistance if you give them a little bit of choice. Violent verbally and physically. They're hitting and kicking, not you, but hitting and kicking things and slamming doors and putting fists through walls and swearing and yelling and talking back. Incredibly upsetting, but I want to normalize this. It's that intensity again that we saw at 9, only tenfold. Their humor is smutty and it's insulting. They love to gossip, and just a warning, they gossip about everything, including what's happening in your home. So if there's something you don't want everybody in the world to know about is happening at your house, better be careful about what you're talking about or arguing out loud, because they have absolutely no filter about sharing anything. So there's nothing that's kept private. It's a very physical age. They love motor games. Friendships are extremely important, that love and belonging. What comes with that love and belonging, though, is a lot of quarreling, a lot of groups that break up, get together, friendships that break up, get back together. They're alert, they're energetic, they're imaginative, health-wise, sick a lot. They have colds, they have flu, they have ear infections, they have pneumonia. This is really a year of disequilibrium across the board, including their physical health, well-being. They fatigue very easily, and it's very pronounced. A lot of kids' allergies turn to asthma at 11. They complain about their feet hurting. They have a lot of tension outlets. So this is important. And I'm going to take my glasses off to kind of show you. So their tension outlets now are oftentimes what we call tics. And tics, when they're anxious, when they're tired, you'll see them occur more. They happen a lot during 11, 12, and 13. We tend to see them start to go away a little bit more at 14, but you'll see them do a lot of blinking. So you'll see them like blinking their eyes, and you'll be like, do you have something in your eye? It's like they don't have something in their eye. That's a tic. That is just a tension outlet thing. They do a lot of sort of sniffing or grimacing. So you'll hear them all day long going, and you'll be like, go blow your nose. And they're like, my nose isn't running. And it isn't. They're just sniffing. Or you'll be looking at them, and suddenly they'll just make this face and kind of make this weird face, grotesque face. They're completely oblivious to it, but it's really disconcerting for you because it's like, what was that? That's a tic. You don't want to say anything. If you bring their attention to those tics, they generally only make them more anxious and self-conscious. And so, of course, they're going to tic more. So They're just normal. It's just part of the neurological development that's happening in the brain at this point. They have peculiar smiles sometimes. They'll just be sitting there and all of a sudden you'll see them do this weird kind of smiley thing. And you'll be like, what? And they're like, what? And it's just a tick. So all of those I think are really important for you to understand because they can be really disconcerting if parents don't understand the developmental aspect of that. They fall a lot. They drop and break things a lot. So, like some of the other disequilibriums we've talked about, it becomes a very physical thing as well. Sexuality wise, they're more interested in sex than they were at 10, but in a different way. They're interested in, books and pictures and jokes. So it is an age where you're going to start monitoring computers. You're going to be sure you've got good filters on because a lot of these kids have no idea what they're getting into. They just happen onto something. And then self-care wise, ravenous appetites. They're finicky eaters at home, not at other people's houses. They're really sweet and mannerly about food, but very finicky at home. They have trouble going to sleep. They can read until midnight, which is part of this is a challenge because kids need at least 9 hours of sleep at this age. And a lot of them aren't getting to sleep until midnight and then have to get up again at 6 or 7 for school. So sleep deprivation is an issue. And with sleep deprivation, all of these characteristics, including the tics, get worse. So it's a challenge around sleep. They tend to do a lot of spilling over, kind of more tantrumy, more agitated, more sort of poor attitude-ish, more definitely oppositional if they are tired. And so that whole circle becomes a problem. They don't want to sleep alone. This is the last age where kids actually want to sleep with their parents. They're really scared about sleeping alone at 11. And honestly, sometimes I'll say to people, if you have a bed big enough and you can get enough sleep yourself, sometimes it's really a blessing for both of you to have that to sleep together because that last few minutes before they go to sleep and those first couple minutes when they first wake up may be the only sweet moments you have where they're not picking at you, complaining, being intense. And so it kind of helps with rapport if it's something that you find tolerable. Once they're asleep, they do sleep through anything, so they tend not to wake up a lot. They do have difficulty getting up in the morning, probably because they aren't getting enough sleep. They are resistant to bathing. We're going to see this all the way through middle school, resistant to bathing, resistant to any kind of self-care. So they'll start to be needing deodorant, or their hair is going to get greasy, or their faces are going to start to break out. And they just are not in the least bit interested in that. They brush their teeth only with reminders. They don't necessarily do them well. But I do want to say that, this is going to be the name of the game. Their peers do not judge them. Their peers are like them. So parents will oftentimes get really naggy and critical and kind of shaming about this behavior of not having the best hygiene at these 3 years. But it's only going to make it worse if you say things because of their self-esteem and love and belonging. So, make things available, have a deodorant available, let them know it's available, encourage them to have clean clothes, etc., etc. But don't make this a big issue developmentally. Emotionally, they recognize their feelings. They cry easily. They cry often at 11. They have very little ability to not need things immediately. They absolutely live in immediacy. Extremes of really happy to really sad is normal. Great big swings in terms of emotions. They're afraid to be alone. They're afraid of pain and infections. Their feelings are easily hurt, girls, especially by fathers. So this is really important to point out to dads that this is a time to be very careful about what they say, even with humor, because girls can be so affected by it. They're jealous of other people. They're jealous of what other people possess and experiences they've had. They're silly, 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 silly age with each other, with you. It's an intense age of worry. Another big year of anxiety for those of you who have anxiety, children with anxiety, and they're very competitive again. Friendship wise, their friendships are not casual anymore like they were at 10. They're very conscious of selecting friends, tend to look for people who have some similar temperaments. Boys usually have one or two, maybe good friends. Girls generally have 3 to 5, and they move around in groups. They like spending time at others' homes and overnights. They're openly announced relationships. The kids call it dating, even if they don't actually talk to each other, even if they don't actually do anything. They just means that they like each other, and it's acknowledged. Boys can be pretty inappropriate in teasing and may need a lot of coaching this age, just because they're awkward and not sure how to show attention and interest. And they usually go to school just primarily for kids, not for academics. So you get a sense of what you're going to start to run into at 11, 12, and 13 and 14 a little bit. They start to come out of it at 14, but 11, 12, 13 is really challenging to parent developmentally and take sort of a new tool set to do that. Now, I want to go through this one a little bit, this piece that we would go more into in middle school with middle school development. But I want you to understand, those of you who have 11-year-olds, that this is really brain driven. So once your child brain gets to age 10, the gray matter starts to thin. And when that gray matter starts to thin, we lose synapses. And as we lose synapses, we lose skills. So some of the behaviors like responsibility and accountability and some of the things that we think just get better, 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 that is not how development works. Up to age 10, it kind of goes up, 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 and then goes way down at 10 or at 11, 12, and 13, partially 14, and starts back up. And as we get new synapses in our brains, we then start to see some of these behaviors move in back into what you would expect: more capability academically, more self-regulation, more predicting consequences, more responsibility, etc., etc. But you're going to see a huge dip for a while before that adult brain starts to really form again. And that adult brain does not come into fruition until 25, somewhere between 25 and 30. So the earliest is 25 and up to age 30. So I just want people to be realistic and understand that these behaviors you're going to start to see sometimes in late grade school, if you have an 11-year-old, are normal behaviors. So the behaviors you'll see are they're going to be incredibly distracted, incredibly disorganized, incredibly disinterested. So a lot of these kids are not interested in school anymore, not interested in performing, sometimes want to quit sports, want to quit their instruments. A lot happens in this brain development that is normal. And part of that is the disdainfulness that you are going to get a massive taste of at 11. So distracted, disorganized, disinterested, and disdainful are going to be the name of the game for 11, 12, 13, starting to improve at 14. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more about that for middle school for those of you who are moving that direction. But I wanted to be sure we normalized it because I want people to not abnormalize what's going to be normal behavior if you have an 11-year-old or have a child who turns 11 during elementary school. So questions about that?
Looks like I have a question. Can you please talk a bit about siblings' age differences in terms of equilibrium and disequilibrium? If
That's a
for,
great,
if for example, the age difference is 3 years.
yeah, that is a really, really good question. If we were talking about sibling relations, it's one of the first things I would talk about is what happens during years of equilibrium and disequilibrium. So it is really challenging because if you have a child, for example, who's in disequilibrium, they're going to be really hard with their siblings. If you have a child who's in equilibrium and a child in disequilibrium, the child in disequilibrium is going to be hard on the child in equilibrium, and you're going to want to wring their necks sometimes because you just want to say, leave them alone, or quit picking on them, or quit criticizing them, or quit, fiddling with them or teasing them or whatever is going on. If they're both in disequilibrium, it's just a hard year. And we'll have parents that'll be like, it's hard. You've got two kids, and both are in disequilibrium. So you're going to see a lot of conflict. You're going to see a lot of annoyance. You're going to, it's going to be a hard year. The good news about that is every other year they'll have two kids in equilibrium, which means two kids in equilibrium is kind of a sweet year for siblings. So you'll see it really change. Sibling relationships change drastically with development. And so it is one of those things you kind of have to be ready to shift and have new tools for, depending on what year you're dealing with in terms of your kids' spacing. So does that answer your question? You can
unmute. Yeah. Unmute everybody if they can.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for answering.
Yeah, it's really challenging.
It looks like we do have another question. Okay. Is there any age where sensory issues start to diminish? My daughter struggles with clothing. Sometimes it looks like anxiety. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's another
because of the timing when clothing starts to feel funny, such as getting off of the bus, etc.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And generally what we see is that when kids are in equilibrium, that's the 8, 10, it's supposed to be 6. It's hard for me, part of 6 maybe, but 8 and 10, we tend to see that kids manage sensory a little better. Definitely not 9, definitely not 7. And sadly enough, 11 through 13, sensory is very hard for them when they're going through that brain pruning. So that brain pruning is really, I think what I want to say about that age is that when that brain pruning happens, it is really challenging to live with and manage and deal with developmentally. But I really want to remind people that if it's hard for you, imagine what it's like for your kids to have that brain pruning and not be able to filter out any of that sensory. So one of the characteristics of that brain pruning is you can't filter out your environment. And so it's just like being barraged. Those kids who have sensory issues in middle school are really literally tortured by their environment sometimes. A younger sibling whistling, a father chewing can make them crazy because they just can't filter out things. That's why we see so many kids in middle school actually kind of go off into their bedrooms, to their caves. And I think without even knowing why, part of that is because it's a way of controlling the sensory that is so intensely barrage, so it's that intense barrage of sensory input. So equilibrium helps with sensory. Disequilibrium generally is more difficult. 11, 12, 13 with the brain pruning is very challenging. As they get more synapses, as they move to their adult brain, it gets more manageable again. So hopefully that answered that.
Let me see. I don't see anything else in the chat. I'll ask to unmute just for maybe one more. If anybody has anything.
I have one last question. It looks like what you're describing seems universal for all children, but is it possible that for some cultures, because you know the environment is different in different countries, maybe those symptoms that you're describing are milder or maybe stronger? What is your opinion on?
I think absolutely that would be true.
Mhm.
Because it's everything is always interfaced with development. Is everybody clear about that? So your environment interfaces with that, your temperament interfaces with that, your family dynamics interface with that development, your sibling order interfaces with that development.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
it inevitably where you lived would interface with that development. The development would be consistent, but how it manifested or the intensity would probably be different or could be different.
Do you happen to know kind of which country has the most behaved children? I'm just curious.
Has the most what? Say it again.
Most behaved children, or it's easier to raise children in?
So I think it really, that's another really complex question because
Yeah.
it's defined so differently.
Mhm.
There are some cultures where obedience and regularity and are so intense, and that would be measured, whereas other cultures don't measure that as good, well behaved. If you're talking about, I think there are cultures where that are more relaxed for children, that some of these
Mhm.
characteristics may look less intense because the demands aren't as great,
Mhm.
and the anxiety may be diminished. So I think it would be hard to describe that because you'd almost have to look culture to culture.
Yeah, yeah. Can I ask one last question? It looks like a lot of what you described for each age kind of overlaps with neurodivergent symptoms. Um,
Absolutely.
so for parents, how do we approach this? Is this normal developmentally, or is my child having some, is he on the spectrum? How do we
I
figure
think
this out?
I think that's always a challenge, and even where they are on the spectrum, because, with neurodivergence, a lot of times with development, it's like like you said, it can look like this, like they're on the spectrum. And even if they're in equilibrium, sometimes if they're on the spectrum in a place, it just is a little quirky. And then we call it temperament.
Mhm, mhm.
And so, I think it's why the benefit of why we now have a spectrum instead of literally calling kids, it's like, no, there's a spectrum. And, we may have quirkier kids, and it may or may not be on the spectrum. It's just, it's so hard to say. But what I would say in general is if it were something that needed to be addressed, or it probably would be a concern, would be if you didn't see it change from year to year. So
I
you
see.
may
Yeah.
see it look, like they're definitely on the spectrum in disequilibrium, and then they go into equilibrium, and it's like, oh, maybe they're not on the spectrum,
Mhm, mhm. Yeah,
and
yeah.
that would probably mean that they are really, on the spectrum in that really end of quirky,
Mhm, mhm.
but not an issue. Or, but if it occurred all the way through development and was pretty obvious, then it might be something to be addressed.
I see. I see. So I guess this is why people have evaluations, in consecutive years, in different years, not just one.
Exactly.
I see. I see.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Looks like I have another question. For years of disequilibrium, it's getting late and that word is getting more difficult. What is a helpful mindset to take as a parent, such as repeating the word patience, planting seeds?
I think for one thing, normalizing it. It's why I want people to understand that disequilibrium is normal, and that it's not only normal, but it's really growth. Because I think so, because so many of us grew up with in families and with parents who had no idea about development, development and brain development, and equilibrium and disequilibrium, etc. That a lot of the sort of really early information we got was looking at what were normal behaviors as bad or something that we had to nip in the bud or get rid of. And so by normalizing these, I'm hoping that it will make you less fearful. I think that a lot of that reaction from our parents in their lack of information came from a place of fear of them being judged, of you being judged, their child being judged. And so they were very reactive and sometimes punitive and I'm hoping that by normalizing these disequilibriums, that people can work with them, but work with them in a more responsive teaching mode than in that fearful mode, which is going to be more effective anyway.
She just replied back, thank you. That was very helpful.
Good. Okay. Anyone else?
It looks like I have nothing in the chat.
Okay.
We should. One more second, just in case. Okay.
Great. Thank you, you guys.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Candice, and I'm looking forward to the next class. We'll have it out next month.
Me too. All right.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, Candice. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you.
Welcome.